This is Fresh Tracks Weekly. This week we are skipping the deeper dive because Randy is out chasing turkeys, but we still have some news to get out. In Montana, the legislature recently concluded with the only remaining actions being signing of bills by Governor Gianforte. Several bills passed that are largely considered wins for public land hunters, including SB 537 and HB 932, both of which are dealing with the distribution of marijuana tax revenue. So the bills themselves kind of compete with one another, but either bill is substantially better than SB 307, which would have removed all conservation funding from the marijuana revenue account. This is following the 2023 legislative session, which featured a lengthy debate and compromise bill to distribute this marijuana tax that was eventually and ultimately vetoed by Governor Gianforte, despite having support from the majority of lawmakers. Honestly, I'm not sure how this plays out now. As both bills compete with one another, I assume Gianforte will choose one or possibly veto both. Again, like last time, both bills change how the marijuana tax revenue will be distributed. HB 932 only adjusts the conservation allocations, creating a habitat legacy account. Under this bill, 75% of the conservation funding would go to a land and wildlife stewardship fund managed by Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. Another 20% would go to wildlife habitat improvement projects, and 5% would go to the wildlife highway crossing account, which we discussed in last week's episode. So the other bill, SB 537, maintains the current conservation funding with the splits among habitat and conservation, parks and non-game wildlife, trails and recreation. What it does do is change the other distribution, pulling from what would typically go to the general fund and redistributing that to a variety of other services. So either bill is acceptable to most hunters and anglers, though it seems that conservation groups seem to favor HB 932. It'll be interesting to see what Gianforte does, though it's starting to feel like deja vu, with the legislature having ended and being unable to override a veto if he decides to kill these bills. So other legislative updates in Montana include the passage of a bill allowing Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks to choose whether or not to raffle or auction off statewide moose and bighorn sheep tags in the future. The bill was pushed by backcountry hunters and anglers following last year's efforts when BHA raffled off the statewide mule deer tag rather than auctioning it, raising a record amount of revenue for that particular tag. Previously, these particular sheep and moose tags had to be auctioned off, and the conservation groups were not allowed to raffle them even if they preferred to. The bill did face opposition from the Wild Sheep Foundation and Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation, primarily because sheep permit auctions have historically raised an enormous amount of money, sometimes upwards of $300,000 for a single tag. So this bill does not prohibit auctions, it simply allows for them to raffle or auction. Still, I can understand why some groups were wary, especially given that some states like Arizona have moved away from auction tags completely. If I had to predict, I would say that the sheep tag will likely continue to be auctioned given that its revenue brings in a ton of money. The moose tag, however, I could see going the raffle route. For years, the auction tag averaged only around $20,000, although last year it did bring in $66,000. It'll be interesting to see how the conservation groups make their pitches to FWP on whether they want to raffle or auction these tags. Another bill passed that expands Montana Block Management Program, making it easier to compensate landowners who allow access through their private property to reach public lands. This is definitely seen as a win for public land hunters, creating additional avenues to secure hunting access. In California, the Sierra County Sheriff's Office declared the region, quote, under siege after at least 18 confirmed wolf-related attacks were reported in April. Wolves originally extirpated from California began returning in 2011 from Oregon. There are now 7 confirmed wolf packs across the northeastern part of the state. They are still classified and managed under the Endangered Species Act, making lethal management very limited, if not impossible. While the California Department of Fish and Wildlife has remained relatively quiet on the matter, the Sheriff's Office has been raising the alarm about these attacks. Reported incidents include wolves chasing an elk to a local resident's front doorstep, killing it another 50 yards away. Another case involved a severely injured deer in someone's yard, and an incident where a rancher's calf was killed while a CDFW game warden was patrolling the property. That last case was especially criticized as it shows evidence that current hazing policies aren't working. Local residents are growing increasingly concerned. It'll be interesting to see how the state responds to this growing predator population in these areas. Arizona Senator Ruben Gallego recently sent a letter supporting the decision to use public lands to help address the housing crisis. Interior Secretary Doug Burgum and HUD Secretary Scott Turner previously announced plans to create a joint task force on federal land housing. The task force aims to identify land that can be sold, transferred, or leased for affordable housing development. We discussed this in past episodes, how previous efforts like this have rarely resulted in actual affordable housing, and promises to offset land sales by purchasing other land or contributing to conservation projects often go unfilled. Still, this letter from Gallego suggests that momentum is building, especially with bipartisan interest in pushing it forward. In Oklahoma, Senate Bill 448 was recently signed into law. It now requires non-resident hunters to get permission from the Oklahoma Conservation Commission to access certain areas on wildlife refuges or wildlife management areas. The change stems from concerns over overcrowding on public lands and an effort to manage hunting pressure more effectively. The permission will be issued through a lottery system, and the commission can charge a fee of up to $100. This is a significant shift as it creates a separate permit and fee to access public land, not just for hunting the game itself. Typically, states are charging for access to the game animal, not for access to the land. This law could open a new chapter in how agencies regulate hunting access. A new film, Unwired, was recently released by the Wyoming Migration Initiative, and it tells the story of pronghorn in Wyoming and how the brutal winter in 2022 and 2023 became a turning point for researchers, land managers, and ranchers to rethink fencing across the prairie. Researchers fitted pronghorn with GPS collars, and the data clearly outlines where fences blocked or redirected migration paths. One rancher whose family previously ran sheep behind woven wire fencing on 10,000 acres effectively excluded pronghorn and was interviewed in this film. Now that they've transitioned to cattle, the woven wire isn't necessary. So when Wyoming Game and Fish approached them about switching to wildlife-friendly fencing, they were happy to cooperate. It's a simple and effective solution, but it still requires funding to pay for or incentivize these ranchers for fence replacement. It's a really cool short film. Definitely check it out. I'll include a link in the video description. Last Friday, the Department of Government Efficiency canceled nearly $400 million in AmeriCorps grants, and at least 85% of the AmeriCorps staffs were placed on administrative leave. AmeriCorps is a federal agency that funds organizations providing community services. It relies heavily on volunteers and low-cost employees to complete projects, including many involving conservation and public lands. This one really stings because everyone I know that's worked with AmeriCorps did it out of passion for the people and for the places that they were helping. There's very little overhead, and the grant money goes directly towards getting things done efficiently. Things like trail clearing, forest fuel reduction, and fence repair are just a few of the many projects that AmeriCorps team members accomplished. So far, 25 states have sued the Trump administration over these cuts, arguing that they were done illegally, as Congress had already approved most of the funding. Well, that's all I got this week. Hopefully Randy's out there finding some turkeys. I'm excited for the episode that they're currently filming, not so much for the turkeys, but more so for the story about one of Randy's conservation mentors, Bob Gibson, and the legacy that he left through his work with the Forest Service. But we will be back next week with plenty of more topics to dive into.